Sometimes the hardest thing about losing someone isn't the grief. It's learning to stand alone in a world that sees you as weak. Margaret Wren knew that truth better than most. In the dust-blown boomtown of Silver Mesa, her late husband left her the saloon, the mine shares, and half the land surrounding the valley. But wealth couldn't buy her protection, not with outlaws circling and rival ranchers eager to push her out. When Caleb Roarke, a rugged mountain man, rode into town looking for supplies, Margaret made him an offer he couldn't refuse. "Be my husband, or you'll be exiled from this town before sundown." What started as a marriage of convenience became a battle of wills between two proud souls. But when bandits threatened everything she'd built, would the woman who controlled others finally learn what it means to trust? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years had passed since Thomas Wren took his last breath in the back room of the Silver Rose saloon, and Margaret could still remember the exact weight of his hand in hers as the fever finally claimed him. She'd loved that man with a fierceness that surprised even herself, a Chicago seamstress who'd answered an advertisement for a bride and found, against all odds, a true partner in the wild territories of New Mexico. Thomas had vision. Where others saw nothing but dust and rock, he saw possibility. Together, they'd built Silver Mesa from a way station into a proper town. The saloon came first, then the general store, then the boarding house. When silver was discovered in the hills, Thomas had the foresight to buy shares in 3 different claims before the rush drove prices skyward. He'd put Margaret's name on everything, the deeds, the contracts, the bank accounts. "You're smarter than me, Maggie," he'd say with that crooked smile of his. "If something happens to me, you'll know what to do." She hadn't believed him then, hadn't wanted to think about a world without his quiet strength beside her. But the fever came in late summer, brought by a trader from Santa Fe, and within a week Thomas was gone. Margaret was 32 years old, a widow with more property than most men in the territory, and absolutely no idea how to protect it. The town had tested her immediately. Ranchers who'd respected Thomas suddenly found reasons to question Margaret's judgment. Miners delayed their payments, claiming confusion about taking orders from a woman. The previous sheriff, a decent man named Walter Hayes, had resigned within a month, unable to stomach the pressure from local power brokers who saw Margaret's inheritance as an opportunity rather than a right. So Margaret learned. She learned to keep the crimson ledger that now sat on her desk, tracking every transaction, every debt, every promise made in her establishment. She learned to wear her finest dresses as armor, crimson velvet that announced her presence before she spoke a word. She learned to modulate her voice, firm enough to command respect, soft enough to avoid being called shrill. She learned which men could be reasoned with and which needed to be outmaneuvered. Most of all, she learned to be alone. The Silver Rose saloon occupied the prime corner of Silver Mesa's main street, a 2-story building with a false front that made it look grander than it was. Margaret lived in the rooms upstairs, a bedroom, a sitting room, and Thomas's old office that she'd claimed as her own. The main floor housed the bar, the gambling tables, and a small stage where traveling performers occasionally stopped. It wasn't fancy by city standards, but it was clean, well-run, and profitable. Lucy Hartwell, a young woman of 25 with auburn hair and a quick smile, managed the day-to-day operations. She'd arrived in Silver Mesa 2 years ago, running from a bad situation in Denver, and Margaret had given her a chance when no one else would. Lucy served drinks, kept the peace, and listened to the gossip that flowed as freely as the whiskey. She was the closest thing Margaret had to a friend. "You're watching the street again," Lucy said, appearing at Margaret's elbow with a cup of coffee. It was mid-morning, the quiet time before the miners came down from the hills and the ranchers rode in for their weekly business. Margaret accepted the cup without taking her eyes off the window. "Habit. You're watching for him specifically." It wasn't a question. Lucy had a talent for reading people, particularly Margaret. "The mountain man who came through last week. He's back. Margaret nodded toward the general store across the street, where a tall figure was loading supplies onto a pack mule. Even from this distance, Caleb Roarke cut an impressive silhouette. Broad shoulders, weathered canvas coat, a hat pulled low over dark hair that brushed his collar. He moved with the economy of someone accustomed to living alone, wasting no motion. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Lucy's voice carried a note of concern. Margaret took a slow sip of coffee. The crimson ledger lay open on the desk behind her, and she didn't need to look at it to know what it contained. Garrett Finch had made his move 3 days ago, presenting documents to the new territorial judge, a man who owed Finch several favors. The papers claimed prior ownership of Margaret's most valuable mineshaft, the Blue Devil, based on some obscure frontier statute about abandoned claims and proper registration. It was all fabricated, of course. Thomas had been meticulous about paperwork, but Finch had money, connections, and a judge willing to overlook inconvenient facts. Margaret's lawyer, such as he was, had explained the situation with apologetic clarity. Under territorial law, a married woman's property interests were stronger. A husband could contest the claim on her behalf, represent her in court, provide the masculine authority that frontier justice seemed to require. Without Thomas, Margaret was vulnerable. With the new husband, she'd have protection. "He doesn't look like the marrying type," Lucy observed. "No," Margaret agreed. "He doesn't." Caleb Roarke had first appeared in Silver Mesa a week ago, leading a string of furs to trade at the general store. He spoke little, paid in coin, and kept to himself. The other trappers and mountain men who occasionally passed through usually stayed for a drink, a game of cards, maybe a room for the night. Roarke had done none of those things. He'd conducted his business and left, heading back into the mountains that rose like a wall to the west of town. But he'd come back. Margaret had made it her business to find out why. The general store owner, grateful for Margaret's past kindnesses, had mentioned that Roarke was stocking up for winter. He'd be making several trips over the next few weeks, buying flour, coffee, salt, ammunition. He had a cabin somewhere high in the Sangre de Cristo range, a place where the law didn't reach, and civilization was a distant memory. A man like that would value freedom above almost anything, which made him perfect for what Margaret needed, and perfectly easy to control. Sheriff Drummond sat at his usual corner table, nursing a beer and trying to look like he had somewhere important to be. He was young for a lawman, barely 30, with a weak chin and nervous eyes. He'd taken the job because it paid better than ranch work, not because he had any talent for keeping the peace. Finch and the other ranchers had backed his appointment, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about whose interests he served. Still, he wore the badge. That would be useful. Margaret set down her coffee cup and smoothed the front of her dress. The crimson velvet caught the morning light, and she knew she looked every inch the wealthy widow. Poised, controlled, untouchable. It was a costume she'd perfected over 3 years, and today it would serve its purpose one final time. "Lucy," she said quietly, "I need you to do something for me. Anything. Spread the word. I want everyone in the saloon at noon. Tell them the widow Wren has an announcement to make." Lucy's eyes widened slightly. "Margaret, just do it, please." Margaret's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. "And make sure Sheriff Drummond stays put. I'll need him to witness what comes next." Across the street, Caleb Roarke finished loading his mule and swung into the saddle of a roan horse that looked as trail-hardened as its rider. He sat there for a moment, his face turned toward the mountains, and Margaret wondered what he was thinking. Did he know how much his life was about to change? Did he have any idea that the woman watching from the saloon window was about to trap him as surely as any snare he'd ever set for game? Probably not. Men like Roarke believed they were beyond the reach of civilization's complications. They believed the mountains would always be there to shelter them, that freedom was something no one could take away. Margaret knew better. She'd learned in the hardest way possible that there was no true freedom in this world. There was only survival. There was only the will to do what must be done, no matter the cost. She turned away from the window and walked to her desk. The crimson ledger lay open to the page where she'd been calculating her options. Next to it sat Thomas's pocket watch, stopped forever at the moment of his death. She picked it up, felt its familiar weight, and then set it back down. "Forgive me, Thomas," she whispered, "but I'm going to do what you taught me. I'm going to survive." At noon, the Silver Rose saloon would be full of witnesses, and Caleb Roarke, who'd ridden into town thinking only of supplies and solitude, would find himself caught in a trap he never saw coming. Margaret Wren was about to make sure of that. The town meeting had been Garrett Finch's idea, and Margaret had let him have it. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy was to let them think they were winning, right up until the moment you pulled the rug out from under them. The meeting took place in the Silver Rose, because it was the largest indoor space in Silver Mesa, and because Margaret owned it. Finch stood near the bar, holding court with the ranchers and businessmen who formed his power base. He was a big man, running to fat now in his middle years, with a florid face and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. His ranch, the Double F, sprawled across the valley south of town, and he'd been expanding aggressively since Thomas's death. Margaret sat at a table near the back, Lucy standing beside her, watching the proceedings with a calm she didn't feel. The crimson ledger remained upstairs in her office, but she'd memorized every relevant entry. Numbers had always come easily to her, the careful accounting of profit and loss, debt and payment, power given and power taken away. "Ladies and gentlemen," Finch began, his voice carrying easily through the crowded room, "we're here to discuss a matter of grave importance to our community. As you all know, the territorial judge has reviewed certain historical documents regarding the Blue Devil mine." Margaret felt Lucy tense beside her. The Blue Devil was the richest of the 3 mines Thomas had invested in, producing more silver in a month than most claims managed in a year. Losing it would cripple Margaret financially, not immediately but inevitably. The other mine shares would only sustain her for so long. "Now, I don't want anyone thinking this is personal," Finch continued, with a glance toward Margaret that made it clear it was entirely personal. "Mrs. Wren is a fine woman, and she's done her best to manage her late husband's affairs. But the law is the law, and the law says that claim was improperly registered. The original stake belongs to the Finch Family Trust, dating back to 1868. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret watched faces, calculating who might be swayed and who remained loyal. The problem was that loyalty meant little against self-interest, and many of these men owed Finch favors or feared his retribution. Sheriff Drummond stood near the door, looking uncomfortable in his role as official witness to these proceedings. He was young enough to still have a conscience, which made him unpredictable. Margaret had considered trying to buy his loyalty outright, but Finch had gotten there first. "The judge has given Mrs. Wren 30 days to contest the ruling," Finch said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false magnanimity. "Of course, contesting it would require proper legal representation, which is expensive and difficult, given the frontier nature of our judicial system." What he meant was clear enough. Margaret could fight this, but she'd lose. The judge was bought, the law was flexible, and a woman alone had no real standing in a territorial court. Thomas had protected her through his connections and reputation, but those had died with him. Margaret rose to her feet. The room quieted immediately, all eyes turning to her. She wore the crimson velvet dress that had become her signature, her dark hair pinned up in a style that was elegant without being ostentatious. She'd learned that appearance mattered, that the performance of power was often as important as power itself. "Mr. Finch raises an interesting point," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The law does favor certain parties over others. A married woman, for instance, has stronger property rights than a widow. Her husband can represent her interests in court, contest fraudulent claims on her behalf." Finch's smile faltered slightly. "Well, yes, but the question then is not whether I can fight this ruling. The question is whether I choose to fight it alone." Margaret paused, letting the words settle. "I've given this matter considerable thought over the past few days. Mr. Finch is correct that my position is vulnerable. So I've decided to remedy that vulnerability in the most practical way possible. Lucy's hand found Margaret's elbow. A gentle warning. Margaret ignored it. "I intend to remarry," she announced. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, some surprised, some skeptical, some calculating the implications. Finch's face went red, then white. He opened his mouth to speak, but Margaret continued before he could form words. "The gentleman in question is already in town. Some of you may have seen him at the general store this morning." She looked toward the door, where Caleb Roarke had just entered, drawn by the crowd and the noise. He stood in the doorway, pack already on his back, clearly intending to leave Silver Mesa and head back to his mountain solitude. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Margaret saw confusion in his weathered face, then wariness as he recognized her. She'd gambled that he'd be curious enough to investigate the commotion, and the gamble had paid off. "Mr. Roarke," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly. "Would you join me, please?" Caleb didn't move. He stood in the doorway like an animal that had caught the scent of a trap, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run. Margaret could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid assessment of danger and escape routes. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," Margaret continued, walking toward him with measured steps. The crowd parted before her, creating a corridor between them. "But I've made inquiries about you. You're a man of reputation in these mountains. Honest, skilled, and importantly, unmarried. Ma'am, I don't know what you think," Caleb started, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm offering you a business proposition," Margaret said, stopping a few feet away from him, close enough to be heard clearly, far enough to maintain propriety. "Marriage, in name only, for a period of 1 year. In exchange, you'll receive room and board, a monthly stipend of $50, and free passage through Silver Mesa's territory whenever you wish to trade. At the end of the year, we'll dissolve the arrangement, and you'll be free to return to your mountains." The silence in the room was absolute. Every person present understood what they were witnessing. A public negotiation conducted in front of witnesses that would be binding by frontier custom even without legal documentation. Caleb's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse?" Margaret had prepared for this moment, had known it would come down to leverage and threat. She felt a twinge of guilt. Thomas would have hated what she was about to do, but survival left no room for gentleness. "Sheriff Drummond," she called, not taking her eyes off Caleb, "would you please explain to Mr. Roarke the town's position on vagrancy and loitering?" Drummond shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, the town council has authorized me to, that is, we have the right to expel individuals who don't have legitimate business." "What Mrs. Wren means," Finch interjected, recovering from his shock with visible anger, "is that Silver Mesa doesn't welcome drifters, especially ones with questionable backgrounds." Caleb's hand moved slightly, an instinctive drift toward where a weapon might hang. Margaret caught the motion and understood immediately. This was a man accustomed to defending himself, to settling disputes with violence when necessary. She needed to de-escalate before someone did something irreversible. "Mr. Roarke," she said softly, for his ears only, "I'm not your enemy. I'm offering you a fair trade. 1 year of mild inconvenience in exchange for more money than you'd make in 3 seasons of trapping. And I give you my word, my husband's grave as my witness, that I will honor every term of our agreement." Something flickered in his eyes. Not trust exactly, but a recognition of sincerity. He studied her face for a long moment, and Margaret forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. Let him see her desperation, she thought. Let him see that she needs this as much as she's forcing it upon him. "Separate rooms," he said finally, "and I come and go as I please. No questions asked, agreed. And when the year's done, you don't try to hold me to anything beyond what we're saying right now. You have my word." Caleb looked past her at the crowded room, at Finch's furious face, at Sheriff Drummond's uncertain expression. Margaret could see him weighing his options. Fight his way out and become a fugitive, or accept the trap and endure it for a year. Neither was a good choice, but one at least offered a clear endpoint. "All right," he said quietly, "but only because you're being straight with me. A lot of people wouldn't be." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Relief, yes, but also a strange sadness. She'd just coerced a free man into marriage, used the power of the town and the threat of exile to bend him to her will. It was necessary, she told herself. It was survival. But it still tasted bitter. "Sheriff Drummond," she said, turning to address the room formally. "I believe you're authorized to perform civil ceremonies in territorial matters." Drummond nodded, looking like he wished he were anywhere else. "Yes, ma'am. I can do that. Then I'd like you to marry us, today, right now in front of these witnesses." Another wave of surprise rippled through the crowd. Finch looked like he might have an apoplexy. Lucy had tears in her eyes, whether from joy or grief, Margaret couldn't tell. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. Drummond stumbled through the words, clearly making up half of them as he went. Margaret spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, the same voice she used for business transactions. Caleb's responses were quieter, almost grudging, but audible enough for the witnesses. There were no rings, no kiss, when Drummond pronounced them married under territorial law. Caleb simply nodded once and took a step back, as if establishing the distance that would define their arrangement. Garrett Finch pushed his way through the crowd, his face twisted with rage. "This is a farce. That marriage isn't legal. It's witnessed by 40 people and performed by a duly appointed officer," Margaret said calmly. "I believe that makes it quite legal, Mr. Finch. And as a married woman, I now have a husband who can represent my interests in court. I look forward to seeing you at the hearing next month." She took Caleb's arm. He stiffened at the touch, but didn't pull away, and led him toward the stairs that climbed to her private rooms. Behind them, the crowd erupted into excited chatter. Tomorrow, this would be the talk of the entire territory. The Iron Widow, who'd cornered a mountain man and married him in front of the whole town. Margaret didn't look back. She'd made her play, and now she'd have to live with the consequences. She'd gained a husband and saved her property, but she'd also trapped herself in a false marriage with a stranger who had every reason to resent her. At the top of the stairs, she released Caleb's arm and unlocked the door to her rooms. "The guest bedroom is there," she said, pointing. "I'll have Lucy bring up your things from wherever you stabled your horse. We should discuss the practical arrangements of this situation, but I imagine you need some time to process what just happened." Caleb stood in the doorway, his pack still on his shoulders, looking at the fine furniture and the civilized trappings like they were instruments of torture. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "You didn't leave me much choice down there." "No," Margaret admitted. "I didn't. I'm sorry for that. Are you?" He met her eyes, and she saw anger there, but also something else. A weary acceptance, as if he'd always known the world would catch up with him eventually. "Or are you just sorry you had to show everyone what you're really like?" The words stung because they were true. Margaret had revealed herself today, stripped away the veneer of gracious widowhood to show the calculating survivor beneath. Thomas would have been disappointed. He'd always believed in doing right by people, in building trust rather than demanding obedience. But Thomas was dead, and Margaret was alone. And sometimes survival required becoming someone you didn't particularly like. "Both," she said quietly. "I'm both, for whatever that's worth." Caleb studied her for another moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll hold you to every term we agreed on. 1 year. Then I'm gone." "I understand." He walked past her into the guest room and closed the door with deliberate care, not slamming it, but making clear the boundary he was establishing. Margaret stood alone in her sitting room, listening to the sounds of celebration, still echoing from the saloon below. She'd won today. She'd outmaneuvered Finch and secured her property and proven that a woman could still find ways to survive in a world built to favor men. So why did it feel so much like losing? The first week of the arrangement passed in a fog of awkward silence and careful avoidance. Margaret maintained her routines, rising early to review the ledger, spending her mornings managing the saloon's business, her afternoons making the rounds of her various investments. Caleb kept to himself, disappearing for hours at a time, returning only to sleep in the guest room that he'd stripped of everything except the bed and a single chair. They saw each other mostly at breakfast, a meal Lucy insisted on serving in Margaret's sitting room, rather than downstairs where the whole town could watch. The young woman had appointed herself mediator in a conflict neither Margaret nor Caleb had the energy to wage, chattering nervously to fill the silences while they ate in opposite corners of the room. "It's not natural," Lucy said on the fifth morning, clearing away the remains of eggs and biscuits that Caleb had consumed in record time before vanishing again. "You're married, but you act like strangers. Worse than strangers. Strangers at least make conversation." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "It is what it is, Lucy. We both knew what we were agreeing to. Did you, though?" Lucy paused, dishes balanced in her arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're both miserable and pretending you're not." "I'm not miserable. I'm safe. There's a difference." Lucy's expression softened. "Oh, honey." "Are you really?" The question lingered after Lucy left, echoing in the quiet of the sitting room. Margaret returned to her desk and opened the crimson ledger, seeking comfort in the familiar columns of numbers. The Blue Devil Mine's output remained steady. The saloon was profitable. Her other investments showed consistent returns. On paper, everything looked secure, but Lucy's question nagged at her. Was she safe? Or had she simply traded one kind of vulnerability for another? Caleb's presence in the building was a constant awareness, like a storm system hovering just beyond the mountains. Margaret found herself listening for his footsteps, tracking his movements through the subtle sounds of doors opening and closing. She told herself it was simple caution. A stranger in her home required vigilance. But she knew it was more than that. There was something about Caleb Roarke that unsettled her. Something that had nothing to do with the forced nature of their arrangement. On the seventh day, Margaret encountered him in the narrow hallway outside her office. He was carrying his rifle, clearly heading out for another of his long absences. They stood there, neither willing to yield the passage, until finally Caleb stepped back against the wall. "Thank you," Margaret said, moving past him. "Don't thank me. I'm just getting out of your way like always." The bitterness in his voice stopped her. She turned to face him, taking in the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the rifle like he was fighting the urge to use it. "You're angry, you think?" Caleb's jaw worked. "You trapped me, Mrs. Wren, put me in a corner and gave me no choice. You got what you wanted, so I guess congratulations are in order." Margaret felt her own anger rising to meet his. "I gave you a fair trade. Money, security, a warm bed. A cage is still a cage, no matter how nice the bars." He gestured at the hallway, the building, the town beyond. "I had a life before you decided you needed a convenient husband. I had freedom, and I had survival to worry about." The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. "You think I enjoyed cornering you like that? You think I wanted to become the kind of person who forces others into arrangements they don't want?" "I don't know what you wanted," Caleb said quietly. "I don't know anything about you, except that you're willing to do whatever it takes to hold on to your property. Maybe that makes you smart. Maybe it just makes you desperate." The observation cut deeper than any insult could have. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but found she had no defense to offer. He was right. She was desperate, had been desperate since the moment Thomas died, and left her alone in a world that saw her as prey. "My husband died 3 years ago," she said finally. "He was a good man. Fair, honest, kind. He taught me that if you treat people right, they'll do the same for you." She paused, feeling the weight of Caleb's attention. He was wrong. Or maybe the world changed after he was gone. Either way, I learned that being good doesn't protect you. Being smart does. Being willing to do hard things does. Caleb's expression softened slightly. "What happened to him?" "Fever. It came on fast. Took him in less than a week." Margaret touched the pocket watch chain at her waist, a habit she'd developed without realizing. "I sat with him every hour, tried every remedy, prayed to a God I'm not sure I believe in. None of it mattered. He died anyway, and I woke up the next day owning half the town with no idea how to defend it. Something passed between them then, not understanding exactly, but a recognition of shared loss. Margaret could see it in Caleb's eyes, the shadow of old pain that mirrored her own. "I had a family once," he said, the words coming reluctantly. "Wife, daughter, different life than this one." He stopped, and Margaret knew better than to push. Some stories needed time to be told. "I'm sorry," she said. "Yeah, me too." Caleb shifted the rifle to his other hand. Look, Mrs. Wren, Margaret, if we're going to live under the same roof for a year, you might as well use my given name. He nodded slowly. Margaret, then. I understand why you did what you did. Doesn't mean I have to like it, but I understand it. You were backed into a corner same as me. Different kind of corner maybe, but still trapped. Does that mean you'll stop disappearing for 12 hours at a time? Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Lucy's convinced you're going to walk off into the mountains and never come back. Thought about it, Caleb admitted. More than once. But I gave my word, and I don't break my word. Even when I wish I could. He paused at the top of the stairs. I'll be back before dark. And Margaret, next time you want something from me, try asking instead of cornering. You might be surprised what people will do when you give them a choice. He descended the stairs, leaving Margaret alone in the hallway with the uncomfortable realization that he was right. She'd gotten so accustomed to fighting, to protecting herself through control and manipulation, that she'd forgotten the simpler approach of honest dealing. That afternoon, Margaret ventured into the part of town she usually avoided, the rough collection of shacks and tents where the miners lived between shifts. She was looking for information about Caleb, and the miners were the ones who'd notice a mountain man's habits. What she learned surprised her. Caleb spent his days working, not for pay, but fixing things. He'd repaired the pulley system at the entrance to the Silver Bell mine. He'd helped shore up a collapsed roof at one of the boarding houses. He'd even spent an entire morning teaching a young miner how to properly sharpen and maintain his tools. Doesn't say much, one grizzled prospector told her. But he knows his business. Men like that, you can tell he's lived hard and learned from it. We could use more like him around here. Margaret returned to the Silver Rose with a new understanding of the man she'd married. Caleb wasn't just hiding from civilization. He was struggling with it, trying to find purpose in a world that suddenly felt too small for him. The mountains had been his escape, his refuge from whatever pain had driven him there. By forcing him to stay, she'd taken away the one thing that gave him peace. That evening, when Caleb returned just as the sun was setting, Margaret was waiting in the sitting room. She'd dismissed Lucy for the night and set out 2 glasses of whiskey. Good whiskey, not the rot gut they served downstairs. We need to talk, she said as he paused in the doorway. And this time I'm asking, will you sit with me for a few minutes? Caleb looked at the whiskey, at her, at the open chair across from where she sat. For a moment Margaret thought he'd refuse. Then he set down his rifle, removed his coat, and settled into the chair with the wariness of a man who'd been ambushed too many times to ever fully relax. I made inquiries about you today, Margaret said, sliding one glass across the small table between them. Not to spy, to understand. I learned you've been helping people. The miners speak highly of you. They needed help. I know how to do things. Seemed wasteful not to. Caleb picked up the glass but didn't drink. That a problem? No, it's admirable. Margaret took a sip of her own whiskey, gathering courage. I want to apologize. Not for the arrangement itself. I won't lie and say I regret doing what I had to do. But for the way I did it, for treating you like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be reasoned with. Caleb's eyes narrowed. What changed? Honest answer? Lucy wouldn't stop pestering me about how miserable we both look. And she's right. This doesn't have to be a war, Caleb. We're stuck with each other for a year, whether we like it or not. We could at least try to make it bearable. Bearable how? Margaret set down her glass. You help me run things. Not the saloon, I know that's not your world. But the properties, the investments. You clearly have skills people need. Let me pay you properly for that work, beyond what we agreed. And in exchange, I promise to respect your boundaries. No more manipulation. No more treating you like you owe me something beyond the terms we set. Caleb was quiet for a long time, studying her face like he was reading tracks in snow. Finally, he lifted his glass in a small salute. To bearable, then. It's better than miserable. They drank together as the last light faded from the windows. It wasn't friendship, not yet. Maybe it never would be. But it was a start. A fragile truce between 2 people who'd been forced together by circumstance and were slowly learning that survival might mean something more than simply enduring. Outside, Silver Mesa settled into its evening rhythms. In the hills beyond town, Garrett Finch was plotting his next move. In the mountains to the west, dangers were gathering that neither Margaret nor Caleb could yet see, but for one quiet evening, in a sitting room above a saloon, two wounded souls sat in almost comfortable silence and discovered that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to face everything alone. The preparations consumed the next 2 weeks. Caleb worked from dawn until well past dark, organizing the miners into defensive positions, teaching them the basics of coordinated resistance. Margaret converted part of the saloon's basement into an armory, purchasing every rifle and box of ammunition she could find within 100 miles. She'd shed her crimson velvet for practical calico and leather, working alongside the men to fortify weak points around the most valuable properties. The transformation surprised the town, the Iron Widow getting her hands dirty, wielding a hammer with the same precision she'd once applied to her ledger books. "You're good at this," Caleb observed one afternoon, watching her help reinforce the outer wall of the Blue Devil Mines processing building. Margaret drove another nail home, feeling the satisfying bite of wood, accepting metal. "Thomas and I built this town together. I didn't just manage the books. I helped raise every building in the first year. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that I could do more than give orders. You're remembering now." There was approval in Caleb's voice, and something warmer that made Margaret's pulse quicken. They worked side by side through the afternoon, and Margaret found herself acutely aware of his presence, the way he moved, the quiet competence of his hands, the occasional brush of his arm against hers in the close quarters. The awareness wasn't new, but it had grown stronger over recent weeks, harder to ignore or dismiss as simple proximity. That evening, Caleb gave her a shooting lesson behind the saloon. Margaret had fired rifles before, but Caleb taught her to shoot with purpose, accounting for distance and wind, breathing and timing. "The difference between hitting a target and stopping a threat. You're a natural," he said, after she'd grouped 6 shots within a handspan at 30 yards. "Good eye, steady hands." "I had a good teacher." Margaret lowered the rifle, suddenly conscious of how close they were standing. The sun had set, leaving them in the purple twilight that made everything feel intimate and temporary. Caleb reached out to adjust her grip on the rifle, his hands covering hers. "Like this. Don't fight the recoil. Let it happen and bring the barrel back to center." Margaret's breath caught. It was the first time he'd deliberately touched her beyond the necessary courtesies of their public performance as husband and wife. His hands were rough with calluses, warm against her skin, and she felt the contact like an electric current running from her fingertips to her core. "Caleb," she whispered, not sure what she meant to say next. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret saw her own confusion reflected in his eyes. The space between them felt charged with possibility, months of careful distance suddenly collapsing into this single moment of connection. He leaned in. She tilted her face up to meet him. Their lips touched, tentative at first, then with growing certainty as weeks of unacknowledged longing found expression. The kiss was everything Margaret had told herself she didn't want. It was vulnerability and risk, the possibility of loss wrapped in the sweetness of present connection. But it was also real in a way that nothing had felt real since Thomas died, genuine emotion rather than calculated survival. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Margaret saw panic flash across Caleb's face. He stepped back, putting distance between them like he was retreating from a cliff edge. "I shouldn't have," he started. "Don't." Margaret held up a hand, her own emotions in turmoil. "Don't apologize. Not for that. We had an agreement. Separate lives, no complications. I know what we agreed to." Margaret's voice shook slightly. "But things change." "People change, do they?" Caleb looked away, jaw tight. "Or do we just fool ourselves into thinking they do? Margaret, in 6 months I'll be gone. Back to my mountains. Back to the life I had before you cornered me in front of the whole town." "That hasn't changed." The words hurt more than Margaret wanted to admit. "So that kiss meant nothing." "It meant—" Caleb stopped, struggling with something. "It meant I care about you. More than I planned to, more than I should. But caring doesn't change reality. I'm not built for this life. Towns, people, expectations, it's not who I am. Maybe it could be, Margaret said softly. If you let it. I had that once. Wife, daughter, a place in a community. I failed them, Margaret. Failed to protect them when it mattered. I can't set myself up for that kind of loss again. Margaret understood then. The kiss had terrified him, not because it meant too little, but because it meant too much. Caring made him vulnerable, and vulnerability led to pain. Better to maintain distance, keep his heart carefully guarded, return to his mountains before attachment became something he couldn't walk away from. I'm scared too, she admitted. Terrified, actually. Thomas was everything to me, and losing him nearly destroyed me. The idea of caring that much again, of giving someone that power over my happiness, it goes against every survival instinct I've developed. Then why push this? Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. Why not just stick to our agreement and make it easier on both of us? Because maybe easy isn't the same as right. Margaret set down the rifle, giving her hands something to do. Maybe some risks are worth taking, even when they scare us. They stood in the gathering darkness, two people caught between fear and possibility, neither quite ready to commit to either path. In the distance a coyote called, long and mournful, a sound that belonged to the wild places Caleb considered home. I need time, he said finally, to think about this, about what I want versus what I can actually offer. I understand. Margaret did understand, even as disappointment settled in her chest. Just don't take too long. The world doesn't always give us the luxury of certainty before we have to choose. Caleb nodded and left her there in the twilight, walking toward the mountains with the purposeful stride of someone seeking solitude to sort through complicated feelings. Margaret watched him go, one hand pressed to her lips where the memory of their kiss still lingered. Lucy found her there 20 minutes later, standing alone in the dark. The young woman didn't ask questions, just put an arm around Margaret's shoulders and guided her back inside. He kissed you, Lucy said once they were in Margaret's sitting room. How did you? I know that look. Seen it in my own mirror enough times? Lucy poured them both whiskey, stronger than usual. And then he ran scared. He's afraid of caring, afraid of losing people again. Aren't we all? Lucy handed Margaret a glass. But we do it anyway because the alternative is living half a life. Maybe he'll figure that out. Maybe he won't. Either way, you can't force it. Margaret thought about her crimson velvet dress, hanging unused in her wardrobe. She'd built so much of her identity around control, around forcing outcomes through will and strategy. But this, whatever was developing between her and Caleb, couldn't be controlled or coerced. It could only be chosen freely and without reservation by both of them. What if he chooses the mountains? She asked quietly. Then you'll survive it. Same as you survived losing Thomas. Lucy squeezed her hand. But I don't think he will. I see the way he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. That man is already halfway gone, whether he admits it or not. That night, Margaret lay awake, listening to the sounds of the building settling, the distant noise from the saloon below. In the next room she could hear Caleb moving, restless, unable to sleep. She imagined him wrestling with the same questions, the same fears. Tomorrow they'd return to preparing for Dutch Kearney's inevitable attack. Tomorrow they'd be practical and focused, partners in survival. But tonight, in the darkness, Margaret let herself hope for something more than just endurance. She let herself imagine a future where Caleb stayed not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Where the mountains weren't an escape, but an occasional visit. Where they built something real from the foundation of their forced beginning. It was a foolish hope, maybe. But then again, Margaret had spent 3 years being sensible and careful, and where had it gotten her? Alone in a big building, wealthy but isolated, powerful but unloved. Maybe it was time to be foolish. Maybe that was its own kind of courage. The attack came at dawn, but not in the way anyone expected. Margaret woke to Lucy pounding on her door, the young woman's voice high with panic. "Margaret!" The miners, someone hit the eastern camp. Caleb was already moving, rifle in hand, when Margaret emerged from her room, still fastening her work dress. They descended the stairs together, finding chaos in the street below. Men were shouting, horses being saddled in frantic haste, the organized defense they'd prepared dissolving into reactive panic. Pike met them outside, his face grim. They hit just before dawn. 4 men dead, supplies burned, equipment destroyed. But they didn't take anything, Mrs. Roarke, just killed and destroyed and left. A test, Caleb said immediately. Seeing how we respond, how fast we can mobilize. Margaret felt cold dread settling in her stomach. They're probing our defenses and finding them weaker than we thought. Caleb was already organizing a response team. Pike, take 6 men to the eastern camp. See what can be salvaged and reinforce the position. I'm going after them. They can't have gotten far. Wait, Margaret caught his arm. You don't go alone. It's too dangerous. I'm the only tracker good enough to follow them through the high country. Caleb's eyes met hers, and Margaret saw determination there and something else. A fierce protectiveness that made her pulse quicken. I'll be careful. I promise. He was gone within minutes, riding hard toward the eastern hills, where smoke still rose in a dark column against the morning sky. Margaret stood in the street watching until he disappeared from sight, fighting the urge to call him back. The day passed in a blur of activity. Margaret coordinated the town's response, redistributing guards, reassuring frightened miners, sending telegrams to neighboring settlements, warning them of the threat. By evening, she was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from the constant pressure of leadership. Caleb returned just after sunset, his horse lathered and his expression dark. He found Margaret in her office, bent over maps and casualty reports that made her want to weep. I tracked them to their camp, he said without preamble. 12 miles north in the canyon country, so at least 20 men, maybe more. Well-armed, well-organized. And Margaret, Garrett Finch was there. The confirmation hit like a physical blow. Margaret had suspected, but suspicion wasn't the same as knowing. You're certain? I got close enough to hear him talking with their leader. A big man, maybe 40, with a scar across his left cheek. They were discussing the next target, the Blue Devil mine, Margaret's most valuable property, the one Finch had tried to take legally before she'd outmaneuvered him with the marriage. When? 3 days, maybe 4? They're waiting for a supply wagon from Santa Fe. Once it arrives, they'll have the ammunition and explosives they need for a major assault. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out over the town she'd fought so hard to protect. We need proof. Something concrete that ties Finch to this gang. I have something better. Caleb pulled a small silver locket from his pocket and set it on her desk. Found this on one of the scouts we captured yesterday. Thought it was just loot at first, but look inside. Margaret opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside was a small photograph. A woman of perhaps 30, standing beside a man in a sheriff's uniform. She recognized the uniform, recognized the building in the background. That's Sheriff Drummond, she said slowly. And the woman, his sister. I asked around after I found it. She disappeared 2 years ago, ran off with an outlaw from Colorado Territory. Caleb pointed to the inscription on the back of the locket. To my darling Dutch, with all my love, Catherine. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Dutch Kearney wasn't just any outlaw. He was Sheriff Drummond's brother-in-law. The sheriff hadn't been incompetent or bought off. He'd been actively sabotaging their defenses, feeding information to the gang, ensuring that Silver Mesa remained vulnerable. We need to confront him, Margaret said. Get him to confess. Use that confession to prove Finch's involvement. Or we use him as bait. Caleb's expression was calculating. Let him think we don't know about the connection. Feed him false information about when the Blue Devil will be most vulnerable. When Kearney's gang shows up at the wrong time, we'll be ready for them. It was sound tactically, but Margaret hesitated. That means letting Drummond continue in his position, continue betraying us. For 3 more days. Then this ends, one way or another. They spent the next hour refining the plan, coordinating with the miners they could trust, setting the trap that would bring Dutch Kearney into a confrontation on their terms rather than his. It was risky. If anything went wrong, they'd lose everything. But doing nothing was no longer an option. As they worked, Margaret found herself watching Caleb, the way his hands moved over the maps, The intensity of his focus, the quiet competence that had become so familiar over the past months. He'd changed since arriving in Silver Mesa, become less solitary and more connected. She wanted to believe it was because of her, because of what was growing between them. But she couldn't shake his words from 2 nights ago. "In 6 months, I'll be gone." "Caleb," she said softly, interrupting his explanation of defensive positions. "After this is over, after we deal with Kearney and Finch, what then?" He looked up, caught off guard by the shift in topic. "What do you mean?"
"I mean us."
"This arrangement, the kiss we're both pretending didn't happen." Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes. "I need to know where we stand." "Not in 6 months now." Caleb set down the map he'd been studying. For a long moment he was silent, and Margaret braced herself for rejection, for confirmation that she'd been foolish to hope for more than their original agreement. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's the honest answer. I care about you, Margaret, more than I thought possible when you cornered me in front of the town. But caring and staying are different things. I'm still working through what I can actually offer beyond 6 months of obligation. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility." Margaret's voice remained steady, despite the emotion churning beneath. "Consider that maybe what started as a trap could become something real, something worth choosing, and if I can't, if I'm too damaged, too afraid, too set in my ways, then at least I'll know I tried." Margaret returned to the maps, needing the distance to maintain her composure. "At least neither of us will spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been." They worked in silence for another hour, the conversation hanging between them unresolved. When they finally finished planning, Caleb moved toward his room, then paused at the door. "Margaret, when this is over, when we've dealt with Kearney and Finch and secured the town, ask me again. About us, about staying? Ask me then, and I'll give you a real answer. Not the one I think I should give, but the one I actually mean." It wasn't a promise, wasn't even really hope, but it was something, and Margaret clung to it as he disappeared into his room and left her alone with her thoughts. The next 3 days passed in careful preparation. Margaret played her role perfectly, confiding to Sheriff Drummond that the Blue Devil would be running a night shift to process a particularly rich vein of ore. She made sure he overheard discussions about reduced security, about guards being pulled to protect the eastern camp. Drummond took the bait. Margaret saw it in his nervous energy, the way he found excuses to leave town, presumably to carry the information to Kearney's gang. She felt sick every time she looked at him, knowing that his betrayal had cost lives, had put everyone in Silver Mesa at risk. On the 3rd day, Caleb returned from his final scouting trip with confirmation Kearney's gang was mobilizing, preparing for a major assault on the Blue Devil mine. Everything was proceeding according to plan. That evening, Margaret stood at her window, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring violence, possibly death. The careful world she'd built, the one where control and calculation kept her safe, was about to be tested in ways that terrified her. But she wasn't facing it alone. Downstairs, Caleb was conducting a final briefing with the miners, his quiet authority transforming frightened workers into a coordinated defensive force. Lucy was organizing supplies, her usual cheerfulness tempered by the gravity of what was coming. Even Pike and the other longtime residents had rallied, choosing to fight for their home rather than flee. Margaret thought about Thomas, about the dreams they'd shared for Silver Mesa. He'd wanted to build something lasting, a place where decent people could make honest livings without fear. She'd preserved that dream through 3 years of widowhood, protected it with calculation and control. But now it was time to fight for it. And maybe, just maybe, she'd discover that she was capable of more than just survival. Maybe she was capable of winning. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, as Margaret turned from the window and began her own preparations for the coming battle, she felt something unexpected. She felt ready. The final preparations began at midnight. Caleb had divided the defenders into 3 groups, one at the Blue Devil mine, where Kearney expected to find easy targets, one held in reserve at the Silver Rose, and a third positioned in the high ground overlooking the approach to the mine. It was textbook tactical deployment, the kind of coordination that spoke to military training he'd never fully explained. Margaret worked alongside Lucy in the saloon's basement, organizing medical supplies and ammunition. The other women of Silver Mesa had volunteered to serve as support, not fighters, but the logistics that would keep fighters in the field. They worked in grim silence, each understanding that by morning some of the men they were preparing for might not return. "You should stay here," Lucy said, arranging bandages with practiced efficiency. "Let Caleb and the others handle the fighting." "I can't." Margaret checked the loads in the rifle Caleb had taught her to shoot. "This is my town, my responsibility. If I hide while others fight for it, what does that make me? Smart?" Lucy tried for humor, but couldn't quite manage it. "Safe? A coward." Margaret set down the rifle and took Lucy's hands. "Thomas taught me that leadership means being there when it matters most. Not giving orders from safety, but standing alongside the people who depend on you. If I'm not willing to risk what I'm asking others to risk, I have no right to ask it." Lucy's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to lose you. You're the closest thing to family I have." "You won't lose me." Margaret pulled the younger woman into an embrace. "I have too much to live for now. Too many reasons to make it through tomorrow." She meant it. Somewhere in the past months, Margaret had rediscovered the will to live rather than just survive. Part of it was Caleb, yes, the complicated feelings they'd been circling around, the possibility of something beyond their arrangement. But it was more than that. It was Lucy's friendship, the miners' trust, the sense of community that had slowly rebuilt itself around her. She'd spent 3 years after Thomas's death believing she had to face everything alone. Now she knew better. Caleb found her an hour before dawn, checking her gear with a thoroughness born of concern. He'd shed his usual canvas coat for darker clothing that would blend into the pre-dawn shadows, and he moved with a coiled readiness that reminded Margaret he was more than just a mountain man. He was a warrior preparing for battle. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low. "As I'll ever be." Margaret finished tying back her hair, keeping it out of her face. She'd dressed in men's work clothes, practical and unencumbering. The crimson velvet dress hung forgotten in her wardrobe, a costume she no longer needed. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said, echoing Lucy's concern. "You've done your part organizing the defense. Let me handle the rest. We've been through this." Margaret checked her rifle one more time, then met his eyes. "I'm going. Not because I think I'm some great warrior, but because this matters. And because—" She hesitated, then pushed forward. "Because I won't send you into danger alone. Not anymore." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. He reached out and cupped her face with one rough hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with unexpected tenderness. "When this is over," he said softly, "we're going to have that conversation you asked for. The real one, without fear or obligation or any of the complications we've been hiding behind. Promise? On my daughter's memory." The words were solemn, carrying the weight of his deepest loss. "I promise." He kissed her then, not with the desperate passion of their first kiss, but with something deeper and more enduring. A promise of possibility, of futures that might be chosen rather than endured. Margaret leaned into it, letting herself believe for a moment that they'd both survive to have that conversation. When they broke apart, dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Time had run out for preparation. Now came the execution. The defenders moved into position in the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret found herself stationed with Pike and 6 other miners on the ridge, overlooking the approach to the Blue Devil mine. Below, the mine buildings appeared deserted, lights burning in the processing shed where Kearney's scouts would have reported night operations in progress. It was a carefully constructed illusion, bait for a trap that had taken 3 days to set. Caleb commanded the reserve force, positioned to flank any assault on the mine. He'd wanted Margaret with that group, but she'd refused, arguing that her presence on the ridge would demonstrate her commitment to the miners who'd risked everything to defend her properties. He'd relented with obvious reluctance, making her promise to stay in cover and fall back at the first sign of the plan failing. They waited as the sky slowly lightened, each minute stretching into eternity. Margaret's hands were steady on her rifle, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd never been in a real fight before, had spent 3 years avoiding direct confrontation through manipulation and maneuvering. Now there was nowhere to maneuver, no clever negotiation that would resolve things. Now there was only the test of will and courage that separated survivors from victims. "There," Pike whispered. Pointing to movement in the valley below, Margaret saw them. Shadows detaching from the deeper darkness. Men moving with the coordinated purpose of trained raiders. They came from the west, using the terrain for cover, approaching the mine buildings in a formation that suggested military discipline. Dutch Kearney knew his business. She counted heads as they advanced. 23 men, all armed, moving in 3 groups that would converge on the mine simultaneously. It was a sound assault plan, would have worked perfectly if the mine had actually been vulnerable. But the buildings below were empty, except for 2 volunteers who would ring the alarm bell and flee at the first sign of trouble. The gang reached the outer perimeter of the mine without encountering resistance. Margaret saw them pause, confused by the lack of guards. Then one of the groups split off, heading toward the processing shed, where light still glowed warm and inviting. The alarm bell rang, loud and urgent, echoing across the valley. The signal, Caleb's reserve force, hit the gang's flank like a hammer. They'd been concealed in a gulch to the south, invisible until they opened fire. The coordinated volley shattered the gang's formation, men diving for cover as bullets kicked up dust and stone around them. Margaret's group added their fire from the high ground, targeting any gang members who tried to establish defensive positions. She aimed carefully, remembering Caleb's lessons. Breathe, squeeze, let the recoil happen. Her first shot took a man in the shoulder. Her second missed. Her third found its mark. The battle descended into chaos. Kearney's gang was tough and experienced, but they'd been ambushed rather than ambushing. They tried to rally, to form a defensive position, but Caleb's tactical planning had accounted for that. Every approach was covered, every potential fallback position pre-sighted for crossfire. Margaret saw Sheriff Drummond then, riding hard from the direction of town. For a moment, she thought he was coming to help the defenders. Then she saw him waving his arms, shouting warnings to the gang, trying to alert them to the trap they'd ridden into. Caleb intercepted him. The 2 men collided in a tangle of horses and flailing limbs, both tumbling to the ground. Margaret's breath caught as she watched them grapple, Drummond going for his sidearm, Caleb faster and more experienced in close combat. The fight was brief and brutal. Caleb disarmed Drummond with practiced efficiency, pinning the younger man to the ground and securing him with swift movements. One threat neutralized, but the battle was far from over. Kearney's gang, realizing they were trapped, had consolidated around their leader. A big man matching the description Caleb had given, scar visible even at this distance. They were fighting with the desperation of men who knew they were losing, which made them more dangerous than ever. Then Garrett Finch appeared, riding from the west with 5 more men. Margaret's heart sank. Reinforcements could turn the tide, could give the gang enough strength to break through the ambush and escape. But Finch wasn't coming to help Kearney. He was fleeing. Margaret saw it in his panicked riding, the way he didn't slow or attempt to join the fight. Whatever deal he'd made with the gang, he was abandoning it now that things had gone wrong. He'd never intended to see this through, just wanted to use Kearney's violence to remove Margaret, then sweep in afterward to claim her properties legally. Caleb saw it too. He signaled to 2 of his men, pointing at Finch's retreating form. They broke from the main battle, giving chase as Finch spurred his horse toward the high country and the promise of escape. The battle at the mine was reaching its conclusion. Kearney's gang, surrounded and outmaneuvered, had lost half their number to death or capture. The survivors were throwing down weapons, raising hands in surrender. Only Kearney himself refused to yield, still firing from behind an overturned wagon. His defiance buying nothing but a few more moments of futile resistance. Margaret saw Caleb approaching the wagon, rifle ready but not firing. He called out something. She was too far away to hear the words, but the intent was clear. Surrender. Live to face trial. Choose something other than death. Kearney's response was to stand, to expose himself fully, and to raise his rifle toward Caleb. Margaret didn't think. She reacted from pure instinct. Her rifle coming up, her breath steadying. Every lesson Caleb had taught her focused into a single moment of absolute clarity. She fired. The distance was extreme, perhaps 200 yards, and the light was uncertain. But the shot was true. Kearney jerked, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air, and then he fell, slowly, almost gracefully, collapsing behind the wagon that had been his final refuge. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person on that battlefield, defender and attacker alike, had seen the shot, had seen Margaret Wren, the woman they'd known as the Iron Widow, the one who gave orders from safety, prove that she was willing to fight alongside them when it mattered most. Caleb looked up at the ridge, finding her immediately. Even across the distance, Margaret felt the intensity of his gaze. Surprise, yes, but also pride, and something deeper that made her chest tighten with emotion. She'd done it. They'd done it. The trap had worked. The gang was defeated, and Silver Mesa was safe. But as the sun rose fully over the valley, illuminating the aftermath of battle, the wounded being tended, the dead being counted, the prisoners being secured, Margaret knew this wasn't truly over. Finch was still out there, still a threat. And somewhere in the wreckage of the morning's violence lay answers they'd need about who else might have been involved in the conspiracy. Caleb climbed the ridge to reach her, moving with the careful gait of someone who'd taken hits but refused to acknowledge them. When he reached her position, he pulled her into an embrace that was equal parts relief and celebration. "That was one hell of a shot," he murmured into her hair. "I had a good teacher." Margaret held him tightly, feeling the solid reality of his presence, the proof that they'd both survived. "Is it over?" "Not yet. Finch is still running, and we need to find out who else was involved." Caleb pulled back enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "But the worst is past. You did good, Margaret. Better than good. You were magnificent." The word wrapped around her like warmth, filling spaces that had been cold and empty since Thomas died. She'd proven herself today, not just to the town, not just to Caleb, but to herself. She was more than the Iron Widow, more than the calculating survivor. She was a woman who could stand and fight for what mattered, who could risk everything for the people she'd come to care about. "We should get down there," she said finally. "See to the wounded, secure the prisoners. There's still work to do, always practical." Caleb smiled, and it transformed his weathered face into something younger and more open. "But yes, work first. That conversation, I promise, that comes later. When we've finished what we started." They descended the ridge together, returning to the valley where their people were already beginning the cleanup. The battle was won, but Margaret knew that the real test still lay ahead, the test of choosing what came next. The test of deciding whether safety and survival were enough, or whether they were finally ready to risk something more. The aftermath of battle was a slow, methodical business. Margaret moved through the wounded, offering water and words of comfort, while Lucy and the other women did the real work of bandaging and stabilizing. 3 miners had been killed, 7 more wounded. The gang had lost 12 men, with another 8 captured, and awaiting transport to the territorial prison. Dutch Kearney lay among the dead. Margaret forced herself to look at him, to acknowledge what she'd done, the life she'd taken. He'd been a killer, yes, a man who'd chosen violence as his trade. But he'd also been Sheriff Drummond's brother-in-law, someone's son, perhaps someone's father. The weight of that death settled onto her shoulders, heavy but not unbearable. "First time?" Pike asked quietly, appearing at her elbow. "Yes, it gets easier," he paused. "That's the terrible part. It gets easier." Margaret nodded, understanding the warning beneath his words. She'd crossed a line today, one that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd killed to protect what she loved, and that changed a person. She'd need to be careful not to let it harden her, not to let the ease of violence become a solution to every problem. Sheriff Drummond sat bound and guarded near the processing shed, his face a mask of misery. Margaret approached him, Caleb falling into step beside her. The young sheriff looked up at their approach, and Margaret saw resignation in his eyes, the knowledge that his betrayal had cost lives and would now cost his freedom. "Why?" Margaret asked simply. "He had Catherine." Drummond's voice cracked. "My sister. Kearney took her 2 years ago, said if I ever wanted to see her alive again, I'd do what he told me. Feed him information, look the other way when his men passed through. I didn't want to. God knows I didn't want to. But you did it anyway," Caleb said, his tone hard. "You let men die rather than ask for help." "Who would I ask? Who'd believe me? Who'd be willing to go up against Dutch Kearney to save one woman?" Drummond looked at Margaret. "I know what I did was wrong. I know people died because of my choices. But she's my sister, my only family. What would you have done?" Margaret thought about Thomas, about the lengths she'd gone to protect his legacy. She thought about how she'd cornered Caleb, forced him into marriage to serve her needs. She understood the desperate calculations that fear produced, the way survival could twist good people into doing terrible things. "I would have asked for help," she said finally. "I would have trusted that someone would care enough to try. That's the difference between us, Sheriff. You chose to carry your burden alone, and that choice cost others their lives." "Where's your sister now?" Caleb asked. "Kearney's camp. He kept her there as insurance, in case I got any ideas about betraying him first." Drummond looked toward the mountains. "If she's still alive. He might have killed her when the attack failed." Caleb and Margaret exchanged glances. An unspoken question passed between them, and Margaret saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They could leave Catherine Drummond to whatever fate awaited her. The sheriff had betrayed them, cost lives, deserved no mercy, but they weren't the kind of people who abandoned innocents to suffer for others' crimes. "How many men did Kearney leave at the camp?" Caleb asked. 2, maybe 3. Most of his gang rode to the attack. Drummond's eyes widened with sudden hope. "You'd go after her?" "After what I did." "We'll go after her because it's the right thing to do," Margaret said. "What happens to you afterward is for the territorial court to decide. But your sister shouldn't pay for your choices." 20 minutes later, Margaret and Caleb rode north with 6 of Pike's best men. The wounded had been stabilized, the prisoners secured, and Lucy left in charge of the town with strict orders to send for the territorial marshal. The chase after Garrett Finch had returned empty-handed. He'd vanished into the high country, but without resources or allies. He'd become a fugitive rather than a threat. The ride to Kearney's camp took 2 hours through increasingly rough terrain. Caleb led them by paths only he knew, mountain trails that wound through pine forests and across boulder fields. Margaret marveled at his ease in this environment, the way he read the land like she read her ledger books. They approached the camp on foot, leaving the horses picketed a half-mile back. Caleb scouted ahead, returning with a tactical assessment delivered in whispered words. 3 men, as Drummond had said. When guarding the prisoners, Catherine Drummond and 2 other women Kearney had taken in previous raids. The other 2 gang members were drinking, celebrating what they assumed would be a successful attack on the Blue Devil mine. "We take them quiet if we can," Caleb said. "Loud if we must. But we get those women out safely. That's the priority." Margaret nodded, checking her rifle again. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm. The fear she'd felt before the battle at the mine had burned away, replaced by something clearer and more focused. She knew what needed to be done, and she knew she was capable of doing it. Together, they moved toward the camp, ready to finish what the morning had started. The camp was a rough affair. 3 tents, a smoldering fire, and a supply cache poorly concealed under canvas. The guard posted near the prisoner's tent was young, barely 20, and clearly not expecting trouble. He died without sound, Caleb's knife work efficient and merciful in its swiftness. Margaret felt sick watching it, but she understood the necessity. They couldn't risk an alarm, couldn't give the other gang members time to use the hostages as shields or bargaining chips. This was the hard arithmetic of survival. The calculations she'd spent 3 years learning to make, Pike and two of his men secured the prisoner's tent, while Caleb led Margaret and the others toward where the remaining gang members were drinking. They'd built their fire too large, sacrificing stealth for comfort, a mistake that spoke to their confidence in Kearney's assault succeeding. "Last chance to pull back," Caleb whispered to Margaret. "Let us handle this part." "No." Margaret's voice was firm. "I'm seeing this through to the end." They hit fast and coordinated. Caleb went in first, his presence commanding immediate attention. The two gang members reached for weapons, but Pike's men were faster, rifles trained and ready. For a moment it hung in balance, surrender or violence, life or death. One of the gang members chose poorly. He brought up his pistol, got off a single shot that went wide, and then Pike's rifle spoke. The man went down, and the fight was over before it really started. The other gang member threw down his weapon, hands raised, terror written across his face. "Don't shoot." "I surrender!" Margaret found herself standing over him, rifle pointed at his chest, and something dark rose in her. The desire to pull the trigger, to eliminate this threat permanently. He'd been part of the gang that had killed her miners, that had terrorized her town. He deserved what his companion had gotten, but Caleb's hand settled gently on her rifle barrel, pushing it aside. "He's done," he said quietly. "It's over." Margaret lowered the rifle, breathing hard, realizing how close she'd come to crossing another line. This was what Pike had warned her about, how easy it became, how the first killing opened doors that were hard to close again. They secured the prisoner and moved to the tent where Pike's men were helping the hostages. 3 women emerged, Catherine Drummond and 2 others, all showing signs of rough treatment but alive. Catherine was crying, a mix of relief and trauma, barely able to stand without support. "You're safe now," Margaret said, helping steady the young woman. "Your brother sent us. You're going home." The ride back to Silver Mesa was slower, hampered by the freed hostages who weren't accustomed to hard travel. Margaret rode beside Catherine, listening to fragments of her story, taken from a settlement in Colorado, held for months, used as leverage to control her brother. It was a tale of casual cruelty, of lives disrupted and autonomy stolen. "Thank you," Catherine said as they neared town. "I know what my brother did. I know people died because he chose me over them. That's something I'll have to live with." "You're not responsible for his choices," Margaret said. "Only your own. What you do with your freedom now, that's what matters." They reached Silver Mesa as afternoon shadows lengthened. The town turned out to meet them, and Margaret saw the change in how people looked at her. Not the Iron Widow anymore, remote and calculating. Now she was something different, a leader who'd fought alongside them, who'd proven that her investment in the town went beyond property and profit. The territorial marshal had arrived, a grizzled man named Carson, who'd seen enough frontier violence to take the morning's events in stride. He took custody of the surviving gang members and listened to Drummond's confession with professional detachment. "He'll stand trial," Carson told Margaret. "Probably get 20 years for conspiracy and dereliction of duty. Could have been worse, could have been a rope. But the judge might show mercy given the circumstances. And Garrett Finch?" Margaret asked. "We'll find him. Men like that, used to comfort, won't last long in the high country. He'll show up in some settlement eventually, and when he does, we'll be waiting." Carson tipped his hat. "You did good work here, Mrs. Roarke. This whole territory owes you a debt." After Carson left with his prisoners, Margaret stood in the street outside the Silver Rose, watching the town return to its routines. The dead had been properly laid out for burial. The wounded were being tended by the territorial doctor who'd accompanied the marshal. The crisis had passed, and life was reasserting its normal patterns. Caleb found her there, still watching, still processing everything that had happened. He didn't speak, just stood beside her in companionable silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that had slowly developed over months of forced proximity that had become chosen partnership. "You promised me a conversation," Margaret said finally. "I did. Are you ready for it?" Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I finally am." They walked together into the saloon, past the celebrating miners and the exhausted defenders, up the stairs to the rooms that had become home to both of them. The door closed behind them, shutting out the world and its demands. And finally, they had the conversation they'd been circling around for months. 3 weeks after the battle, Margaret stood in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Silver Mesa, laying flowers on Thomas's grave. She'd visited regularly over the years, always alone, always wrapped in the armor of her crimson velvet and her carefully maintained distance from emotion. Today, she wore simple calico, and Caleb stood beside her. "I loved him," she said quietly. "Still do, in the way you always loved someone who shaped who you became. But I think he'd understand what's happening now. Would approve, even. He sounds like he was a good man, the best I knew. Until recently." Margaret glanced at Caleb, saw his small smile of acknowledgement. "That night after the battle, when we finally talked, you asked me if I could stay, if I could choose Silver Mesa instead of the mountains. And you said you didn't know." Margaret turned to face him fully. "You said you needed to figure out if you were staying because of obligation or because it was what you actually wanted." Caleb nodded slowly. "I did say that, and I've spent the past 3 weeks trying to answer it honestly. Testing myself, seeing if the walls of civilization still felt like a cage, or if they'd become something different. And?" Margaret's heart was beating fast, but her voice remained steady. She'd learned not to hide from hard truths, even when they scared her. "I'm staying." The words were simple, direct, and utterly sincere. "Not because of our agreement, that ends in 4 months anyway. Not because of obligation or duty or anything, except that I want to. Because somewhere in the past 6 months, this place became home. And you became—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You became the reason I want to stay." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You're certain?" "Because I won't trap you again, Caleb. If you stay, it has to be your choice. Freely made, without coercion. I'm certain." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "That's why I asked the jeweler to make these." Inside the box were 2 simple gold bands, wedding rings, real ones, not the symbolic arrangement they'd entered into under duress. Margaret picked one up, feeling its weight, its solidity. "Marry me again," Caleb said. "Not because you need a husband for legal protection, not because I'm trapped with nowhere else to go, but because we choose each other, freely and completely." Yes, the word came without hesitation, without calculation or careful consideration of risks and benefits. Just pure, simple certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you. Again. For real this time." They stood there on the hill, holding each other, while the wind carried the scent of pine from the mountains and smoke from the town below. It wasn't the romantic proposal young lovers might dream of. There was too much history between them, too many scars and hard-won truths. But it was real and honest, and built on the foundation of 2 people who'd learned to trust each other through adversity. The second wedding took place a week later in the Silver Rose saloon, but this time it was different in every way. The whole town attended, not as witnesses to a forced arrangement, but as celebrants of a genuine union. Lucy served as Margaret's attendant, dabbing at happy tears throughout the ceremony. Pike stood up for Caleb, gruff and uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but clearly pleased. Margaret wore a new dress, not crimson velvet, but a softer blue that Thomas had always said brought out her eyes. She'd thought about him while choosing it, imagining his approval of this new chapter in her life. The past didn't have to be erased to make room for the future. It could simply be honored and then gently set aside. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher who'd arrived in town the previous day, a jovial man who'd heard about the battle and wanted to see the famous widow who'd helped defeat Dutch Kearney's gang. He made the vows longer and more elaborate than Sheriff Drummond's perfunctory words had been, talking about commitment and partnership, the choice to love rather than the obligation to endure. When Caleb kissed her this time, it was in front of everyone, a public declaration that this was real, that they'd chosen each other without reservation. The saloon erupted in cheers, and for once Margaret didn't feel the need to maintain her composed distance. She laughed and cried and let herself be fully present in the joy of the moment. The celebration lasted into the evening. Miners and merchants, ranchers and shopkeepers, All the people who made up Silver Mesa's community gathered to share food and drink and stories. Margaret moved through the crowd, Caleb at her side, accepting congratulations and well wishes with genuine warmth. Later, when the party had wound down and most of the guests had drifted home, Margaret and Caleb stood together at the window of their rooms, no longer separate spaces, but shared. The walls between them finally removed both literally and metaphorically. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, leaning against him. "Build something." Caleb's arm came around her shoulders. "Your town is going to grow. More people will come, drawn by the stability and opportunity. We'll need to expand, prepare for that growth. We." Margaret smiled at the word, at how naturally he included himself in Silver Mesa's future. "We," Caleb confirmed. "I'm done running from connection, from the possibility of loss. Yes, caring about things means they can hurt you. But the alternative, the isolation I chose after Sarah and Emma died, that was its own kind of death. A slower one maybe, but just as final." Margaret thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, the Iron Widow, armored in crimson velvet and calculation, holding everyone at a distance because distance meant safety. She'd survived Thomas's death by refusing to let anyone close enough to hurt her again. But survival wasn't the same as living. And living required risk, required vulnerability, required the courage to let down your walls, even when you knew that pain might follow. "I love you," she said simply. "I fought it for months, told myself it was foolish to feel anything for a man I'd trapped into marriage, but I do. I love you, Caleb Roarke, and I'm grateful every day that you rode into Silver Mesa when you did. Even though you had to corner me in front of the whole town, especially because of that." Margaret turned in his arms, facing him directly. "If I hadn't been desperate enough to do something that bold, we might never have discovered what we could become together." They stood in the window as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who'd found each other through necessity and stayed together through choice. Below them, Silver Mesa settled into its evening rhythms, a town that had survived its trial by fire and emerged stronger for it. In the months that followed, Garrett Finch was captured trying to cross into Mexico. He faced trial for conspiracy and murder, receiving a sentence that would keep him imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life. His properties were sold to pay restitution to the families of those who'd died in his schemes. Catherine Drummond started a school for the town's children, finding purpose in education after her traumatic captivity. Her brother's trial resulted in a 20-year sentence, but he served it with a kind of dignity, accepting responsibility for his choices even as he grieved their consequences. The Blue Devil mine continued to produce, funding improvements to Silver Mesa that transformed it from a rough boomtown into a proper settlement. More families arrived, drawn by stories of the widow and the mountain man who defended their town against overwhelming odds. And through it all, Margaret and Caleb built their life together, not without challenges or disagreements, but with the fundamental trust that came from having chosen each other freely. They had children eventually, and those children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, how a forced marriage became a true partnership. Years later, when Margaret was an old woman sitting on the porch of the house they'd built together, someone would ask her about the secret to a lasting marriage. She'd smile and say simply, "Choose each other. Every day, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's all it takes, the courage to keep choosing." And beside her, equally old and equally content, Caleb would nod his agreement, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of decades spent together. They'd started as strangers, bound by necessity. They'd become partners through adversity. And they'd ended as lovers who'd proven that sometimes the greatest treasures in life come from the places we least expect, even when those places start with an ultimatum delivered in front of a crowded saloon. Sometimes the hardest thing about losing someone isn't the grief. It's learning to stand alone in a world that sees you as weak. But Margaret Wren had learned something else too, that standing alone was a choice, not an inevitability. And that opening your heart again, despite the fear and the risk, was the truest kind of courage anyone could possess. In the dust-blown territory of New Mexico, in a town called Silver Mesa, two wounded souls had found each other and discovered that healing was possible, that love could be chosen rather than simply fallen into, that the scars of the past didn't have to define the possibilities of the future, and that sometimes the best marriages are the ones that start with the words, "Be my husband," or "You'll be exiled," because when you fight your way through that kind of beginning, you know the ending will be worth it.